Orville sat right in front of me, considerately peeling shrimp for Charlotte. She smiled sweetly, and Kuda softly thanked him. Everyone else at the table remained silent, their eyes flickering toward me, waiting for my reaction. Before I could say a word, his so-called white moonlight spoke up first. "I'm sorry, please don't be upset. Orville has always been such a gentleman." Really? But he had never done that for me. I had asked him before if he could peel some shrimp, only to be met with a frown and a dismissive refusal. "You know I don't like the smell of shrimp," he would say, his tone carrying a hint of reproach. That one sentence was enough to silence me every time. But now, the usually aloof and proud Orville was sitting there, patiently peeling shrimp for Charlotte. Looking at her features, so eerily similar to mine, what more was there to understand? Orville furrowed his brows at her comment. "She doesn't know how to peel shrimp. Don't make a fuss." Charlotte smirked at me when Orville wasn't looking, as if asserting her dominance. I raised an eyebrow, nodding slightly as though I was truly considering her words. "Well, since you're being so chivalrous, I suppose I'll have to be a bit more gracious." As soon as I finished speaking, I turned and leaned toward his friend, Reynold. In front of everyone, I reached out, adjusting his collar, then gently wiped the corner of his mouth. "How careless of you," I murmured. "You've got something right here." Reynold stiffened, momentarily startled. His cheeks burned, fingers fidgeting nervously with the hem of his shirt. Thank you," he stammered. Orville's face darkened instantly. He stopped peeling the shrimp, his voice low and tense as he gritted out my name. "Dorothy." I turned to him with an innocent look. "What's wrong? Was I not gracious enough?" His fists clenched audibly, and his gaze turned icy. "If you keep acting out like this, we're done." There it was again, his go-to move. I had spent 3 years chasing after him, always at his beck and call, making myself small. Every time we argued, the moment he threatened to break up, I would scramble to appease him. He was certain I'd cave this time too. But this time I didn't want to keep groveling. A laugh escaped me, sharp and derisive. "Fine." A mix of emotions flickered across his face. Anger, resentment, disbelief. Before he could say another word, Charlotte bit her lip, tugging gently at his sleeve. "Please don't fight because of me. Don't break up over this, okay?" Her eyes were red, teary, looking so pitiful and fragile. Orville immediately bent down to wipe her tears, whispering soothing words as if afraid she might shatter. 3 years. This was the first time I had ever seen him treat someone with such tenderness. And that someone wasn't me. My heart clenched instinctively, but surprisingly, it didn't hurt as much as I thought it would. I realized then, whether it was my joy or my sorrow, it was time to let go. I stood up, walking away. At the door I hesitated, glancing back one last time, holding on to a sliver of hope. But Orville was too preoccupied with Charlotte, whispering comforts in her ear, completely oblivious to my departure. That last bit of hope inside me shattered. Returning home, I swiftly blocked and deleted all of Orville's contact information. Why should I cling to a dead-end relationship, especially one built on such a rotten foundation? What I didn't expect was that Reynold would be the first to reach out. "Reynold, you're just going to use me and then toss me aside?" He even sent a cute crying puppy emoji. The image of the tall, sturdy Reynold using such an emoji was almost comical. I apologized to him, but he quickly responded. "Reynold, it's okay, I'm glad I could help. But I have a basketball game this week. Could you come cheer for me? I saved you a front row seat. Will you come?" He added an expectant emoji. After some thought, I agreed. There was something about Reynold, something familiar, as if I had known him for a long time. But no matter how much I tried to recall, I couldn't remember any past interactions with him. Just then my phone rang. An unknown number. Picked up. "You blocked me." Orville's voice came through, his irritation practically radiating through the speaker. "Yeah, so. Shouldn't I have?" My tone dripped with sarcasm. Can you stop being so unreasonable? What more do you want from me? I couldn't help but laugh. If I recall correctly, we already broke up. Why can't you be as understanding as Charlotte? His voice was laced with impatience. That did it. I laughed, this time in sheer anger. Get lost. I hung up and blocked the number in one swift motion. That night, I picked out a figure-hugging short dress. I had a great figure, curvy in all the right places. Orville used to hate it when I wore clothes like this. At the time I thought it was because he was possessive, that it was a sign he cared. I had secretly felt pleased, agreeing softly to his requests. Now I realized it was simply because Charlotte never wore clothes like this. Though we looked somewhat alike, Charlotte's style was delicate and demure, while mine was the complete opposite. Tossing my long wavy hair over my shoulder, I met my own gaze in the mirror. For the first time in years I felt free. By the time I arrived at the university, the basketball game was about to start. As I stepped inside, a wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. The sunlight bathed my face, casting a warm glow on my porcelain skin. I heard whispers from the spectators. That girl is so pretty. I overheard the murmurs around me as I entered. Seriously, her figure is amazing. What I didn't expect was to see Orville there. One of his friends nudged him and gestured toward me. Well, Orville, your girlfriend is stunning. He didn't correct them. Instead, he strode toward me. His first words accusatory. Why did you leave without a word the other day? Charlotte felt guilty for ages. I gave him a once-over, unimpressed. His gaze landed on my outfit, and his frown deepened. I told you clothes like that don't suit you. Rolling my eyes, I ignored him and turned my attention to Reynold. He noticed and met my gaze. His eyes lighting up instantly. A bright, warm smile spread across his face, like a little sun, impossible to look away from. Smiles must be contagious because I found myself grinning back. Orville noticed the shift in my attention and followed my gaze. When his eyes landed on Reynold, his expression darkened. You're here for Reynold? He asked, his voice tight. I shot back. Are you serious? Who else would I be here for you? He didn't respond. The game began, and it was obvious to everyone that Orville was deliberately targeting Reynold. But Reynold handled it effortlessly, unfazed. He moved like lightning, dodging defenders, lifting the ball high, and sinking it into the basket with precision. His team quickly gained the upper hand, and when the final whistle blew, Reynold was the undisputed champion. Excited, I walked past Orville and handed Reynold a bottle of water. His warm eyes locked onto mine as he leaned down slightly, his face close to mine, and smiled with a hint of pride. So, how'd I do? He asked, his eyes sparkling like a puppy waiting for praise. I couldn't help but ruffle his hair. You were amazing. Amid the noise, I noticed his Adam's apple bob and the red creeping up his ears. Chuckled. You're so cute. Reynold, the easiest person to make blush, hesitated for a moment before finally speaking. I like you. Can I pursue you? His words caught me off guard, his breath warm near my ear. His eyes filled with unmistakable affection. Though we hadn't been particularly close before, I recalled that every time our paths crossed, he seemed a bit nervous. I wasn't sure when or why Reynold had developed feelings for me, but the sincerity in his eyes was undeniable. Before I could respond, Orville's voice cut in at the worst possible moment. Dorothy, have you had enough of this charade? His glare was dark as he watched me hold Reynolds' hand, barely concealing his anger. How long are you going to keep up this ridiculous act? I turned to face him. Charlotte stood behind him, looking smug. Orville gestured lightly for me to come closer. Come here. I can forgive you if you want me to spend more time with you. Just stop this nonsense. His last word carried a commanding tone. Charlotte smirked, one hand on her hip, eyes filled with disdain. I glanced at Orville, calm, confident as always. He never felt urgency when it came to me. Orville, wasn't I clear enough? We broke up. I don't like you anymore. Now you can finally be with the person you truly care about. Aren't you happy? I tightened my grip on Reynold's hand. To my surprise, he didn't pull away. Instead, he studied me as if searching for insincerity in my expression, but there was none. With that, I instinctively took his hand and walked away. Hey, Reynold's voice called after me. I turned to him. As expected, his ears were bright red. He pointed at our joined hands. Realizing what I was doing, I quickly let go and coughed awkwardly. He spoke first. Can I really pursue you? I focused my gaze entirely on him. Seeing me stare, he grew flustered. Why are you looking at me like that? Is there something on my face? His face turned crimson as he anxiously rubbed his cheek. Smiled. Sure. He froze for a moment, then practically jumped for joy, beaming like a child. From that day on, Reynold started bringing me breakfast, snacks, and little treats every day. His friends couldn't stand it and scolded him, but he didn't seem to care one bit. Reynold's friends never let him hear the end of it. Dude, this isn't how you chase a girl. Other guys send flowers every day. And you haven't even given her a single petal. What girl doesn't like flowers? How do you expect to win her over like this? It was like a light bulb went off in his head. From that moment on, I started receiving several bouquets of flowers daily. My roommate stared at the growing pile in our dorm, completely stunned. Does he own a flower shop or something? Sending this many every day. One night at 11 p.m., Reynold texted me. Are you free tomorrow? After a moment's hesitation, I replied, yeah, I'm free. His response came instantly. Great. Get some rest, don't stay up too late. Good night. I was taken aback. Reynold had started texting me every night. Even during the day when we weren't together, my phone would be flooded with messages from him. If I was sick or unwell, he was always the first to show up. One time I forgot to eat breakfast and ended up with stomach cramps so bad that I was sweating from the pain. When Reynold arrived, his usual smile was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he looked frustrated and worried. Without a word, he scooped me up and rushed me to the hospital. My pain blurred my consciousness, but I faintly felt his grip on my hand and heard him mutter, "Why do you always neglect yourself?" It was like this before, and it's still the same now. From that day on, he made sure I ate breakfast every morning, bringing me food without fail. My roommates teased me, saying I'd end up being a husband-whipped wife. Their words made me think about my past. I used to send Orville countless messages, only to receive a single emoji in response. Once, when I had a fever and felt terrible, I called Orville for help. His response: I'm busy right now, stop bothering me. Then he hung up without a second thought. Later, I found out that his so-called busy was just him picking up Charlotte from the airport. I realized then that it wasn't the shrimp peeling incident that truly broke my heart. That was just the final straw. It was the years of one-sided effort, chasing after someone who never truly cared. I chased Orville for 3 whole years, and yet our relationship barely lasted 6 months before falling apart. One day, Orville showed up at my place drunk. He grabbed my wrist and pulled me into his arms, his breath reeking of alcohol. In a slurred, dreamlike voice, he whispered into my neck, "Charlotte." My heart clenched, but I swallowed my pain and reminded him, "I'm Dorothy, not Charlotte." He stared at my face, dazed, before mumbling, "Let's be together." He never said he loved me. He made no promises. It wasn't a confession, it was an order. Back then, I was too blinded by joy to see it for what it was. But now everything was clear. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "I don't agree to the breakup. This isn't something you can decide alone. Stop being difficult. Charlotte is alone in this country. An orphan. She needs me. Can't you be more understanding?" I felt physically sick reading it. I couldn't believe I had loved someone like this for so many years. Truly, love can be a curse. All my frustration condensed into 2 words. Idiot. After sending the message, there was silence. Then another reply came through. You weren't like this before. I rolled my eyes and immediately blocked the number. The next morning, I saw Reynold standing outside my dorm like a statue, holding breakfast. He hadn't called or texted, just stood there silently. He must have been waiting for a while. I hurried downstairs, and the moment he saw me, his face lit up with a bright smile, his joy practically radiating off of him. I took the breakfast from him. Why didn't you call me to come down? He scratched his head, looking a little embarrassed. I thought you might still be asleep. I didn't want to wake you. I couldn't help but laugh. The sunlight filtered through the thin clouds, casting a silvery glow on his face, making him look almost dazzling. Do you have any plans today? He asked, his tone cautious. Not really. What about you? At that moment my phone buzzed with a message. It was from my roommate, Hala. Hala, are you dumb? He's asking if you have plans because he wants to ask you out. Do you get it now? I could practically hear her exasperated tone in my head. Glancing up at my dorm window, I was met with an unexpected sight. Hala and my other 3 roommates, all crowded together, watching us like an audience waiting for a romantic drama to unfold. As I tried to process how they had overheard our conversation, I suddenly noticed Reynold's friend standing nearby, observing us too. Before Reynold could say anything, I cleared my throat, feeling a slight warmth creep onto my cheeks. Let's hang out today. Reynold's smile widened. Sure. It suddenly hit me. I had never actually been on a real date, just the 2 of us. Back when I was with Orville, there were always his so-called sisters around, and when they were gone, Charlotte became the constant presence between us. I had wanted to go to the amusement park with just my boyfriend for so long, but that wish never came true. Until today. Excitement bubbling inside me, I dragged Reynold to the amusement park. The air was filled with screams from the roller coaster riders, one after another. I turned to look at Reynold, who met my gaze with wide, innocent eyes. A mischievous idea formed in my head. Do you want to try something more exciting? I asked, already grabbing his hand before he could answer. I pulled him straight to the roller coaster, expecting him to be nervous, maybe even a little scared, since he always seemed so shy. But after a few rides he was perfectly fine. Not even a scream. Not even a hint of fear. Meanwhile, I nearly lost my soul on that ride. By the time we got off, my legs felt weak, and he had to hold me up, barely suppressing his laughter. Note to self. Never ride a roller coaster with Reynold again. We ended up trying nearly every ride in the park, and our smiles felt permanently stitched onto our faces. It had been so long since I'd had this much fun, this sense of freedom. Reynold was like a little ray of sunshine, spreading happiness wherever he went. By lunchtime we picked a restaurant with good online reviews. When the waiter handed us the menu, Reynold placed our order, and to my surprise, every dish he chose was exactly what I liked. The warmth of being cared for settled deep in my chest. Then, a voice I could recognize anywhere cut through the air. Orville, what's going on with you lately? The tone was sweet, delicate. Charlotte. I stiffened. Of course, the Orville she was talking about had to be him. What a small world. I kept my focus on Reynold, pretending not to hear her. But Charlotte must have caught a glimpse of me because moments later, she was at our table. Dorothy. What are you doing here? She asked, her expression full of fake surprise. Orville followed behind her, his gaze burning into me. I tilted my head. Why? Am I not allowed to be here? Did you book the restaurant? She looked aggrieved, then glanced at Reynold. But this is a couple's restaurant, she said, her voice dripping with insinuation. Only then did I notice the pink balloons, the couple's message wall, the pairs of lovebirds at every table. So it really was a couple's restaurant. I smiled and slipped my arm around Reynolds. I'm here with my boyfriend. What's the problem? At that, Reynolds' ears turned red. I could feel the tension in the air, Orville's cold stare intensifying. Charlotte pouted. You just broke up with Orville not long ago, and you're already with someone new? I'm really envious. Her words didn't bother me much, but then my eyes landed on something. The bracelet on her wrist. My stomach twisted. I knew that bracelet. It was the same one I had given Orville for his birthday last year. I had saved up for months, working multiple jobs, exhausting myself to the point of losing weight just to buy it. And when I finally gave it to him, all he said was a flat, "There's no need for this. Don't buy something like this again." Now, that very bracelet was on Charlotte's wrist. I quickly averted my gaze, forcing myself to ignore the sharp sting in my chest. Before I could process anything further, the waiter approached us hesitantly. "Our restaurant is currently running a promotion," he said. "Couples who kiss can receive a free gift." Charlotte instantly clung to Orville's arm. "Orville," she cooed, "I want that gift." Orville frowned, shaking his head at first. But then his gaze flickered toward me, and something in his expression shifted. His fists clenched. And before I knew it, he leaned down and kissed Charlotte right in front of me. I raised an eyebrow, then playfully gagged, clutching Reynold's arm. "Gross," I muttered. Orville's face darkened instantly. Needless to say, the meal was ruined. I linked arms with Reynold as we walked out of the restaurant, but before the door fully closed behind us, I heard the sharp sound of a plate shattering. Orville's angry voice followed. I didn't bother turning around. We finished our meal at another restaurant, and as if fate had a cruel sense of humor, we ran into Orville and Charlotte again in the parking garage. My eyes immediately landed on Orville's hand. It was injured. What a ridiculously small world. Before I could fully process it, Charlotte suddenly ran up to me, holding out a keychain. "Do you think this is pretty?" she asked, her voice carrying a smug undertone. I raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "It's ugly. Just like you." Her face twisted in anger, but I simply smiled and turned away, walking off with Reynold. Let her stew in it. Reynold couldn't hold back a laugh. Charlotte, clearly not expecting me to be so blunt, froze on the spot. Honestly, the keychain was ugly, one of those cheap trinkets that were painful to look at. Her eyes started to redden, though Orville was still by her side, murmuring something to comfort her. However, there was a flicker of impatience on his face, as if even he was getting tired of this. Just as I turned to leave with Reynold, Orville suddenly grabbed my wrist, squeezing so tightly that I winced. Before I could react, Reynold did. His fist connected with Orville's face in an instant. Orville hadn't expected him to strike in public and took the blow head-on, staggering back. But he recovered quickly and fought back, and before long they were both bruised, trading punches without hesitation. I immediately stepped between them, shielding Reynold and shoving Orville back with all my strength. He stumbled, his face twisting with disbelief and anger. "You pushed me for him," he spat. I spread my arms wide, standing protectively in front of Reynold. "Why can't I push you for Reynold?" Shot back. "You can protect Charlotte, so why can't I protect him?" "Orville, I know you like Charlotte. I've let you go. I've given you what you wanted. But why can't you just leave me alone?" My voice grew stronger, my frustration spilling out. "I'm not shameless. I won't follow you around for the rest of my life like some doormat." Orville staggered at my words, his expression turning complicated. He raised a hand as if to reach for me again, but I dodged it, grabbing Reynolds' hand and walking away without looking back. As dusk settled, we strolled down the quiet streets. The warm glow of the streetlights stretched our shadows long against the pavement. Reynold asked me about everything I had been through with Orville. I told him the truth. For the first time, I spoke about it without feeling weighed down by the past. It no longer hurt the way it once did. But something about Reynolds' silence felt off. Just as I turned to ask what was wrong, he suddenly wrapped his arms around me from behind. I froze in surprise. I didn't struggle, just stood there, confused, as he buried his head against my collarbone. A moment later, I felt something damp against my skin. Reynold was crying. "You!" His voice was muffled, trembling with frustration. How could you let yourself be treated like that? Do you have any idea how much it hurts me to see that?" His words sent a strange warmth through me, making my heart ache and melt all at once. I reached up and gently stroked his hair. A grown man crying like this in my arms. It was unexpected, but I didn't mind. After a while he lifted his head, his red eyes still glistening with tears. His emotions spilled out as he spoke about all the injustices I had faced, each word carrying so much feeling that I couldn't help it. I laughed. I knew it wasn't the right time, but he was just so emotional, and somehow it was adorable. I hugged him tighter, still laughing. He cries more than I do, I thought. How cute. Eventually he stopped crying and we continued walking, hand in hand. After a few moments of silence, I finally asked the question that had been lingering in my mind. "Why did you suddenly start liking me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead he simply smiled. "I'll tell you someday," he said. That day, Reynold took me somewhere without telling me where we were going. When I asked, he just smiled mysteriously. When we finally arrived, I recognized the place immediately. It was the orphanage where I had stayed as a child. I stood frozen in place, staring at the old, crumbling building. "I'm an orphan," I admitted softly, more to myself than to him. The memories came flooding back. On my 3rd birthday, my parents took me out for a drive. We got into a car accident that day. My mother had held me tightly in her arms, trying to shield me. In the end, both of my parents died. After that, I went to live with my grandmother in the countryside. But a few years later, she passed away too. The elderly people in the village whispered behind my back, calling me unlucky. They blamed me for my parents' deaths. Since I had no relatives left, I was sent to the orphanage. I blinked away the memories and looked at the present, the abandoned building in front of me. The door was barely standing, so weak that I could push it open with just a light touch. Reynold turned to me, his expression gentle. "Do you remember this place?" "Of course," I said. But I didn't understand why he had brought me here, or how he even knew about this place. Then he asked something that caught me completely off guard. "Do you remember the little chubby kid who used to follow you around when you were little?" A moment later it hit me. When I first arrived at the orphanage, there was a chubby boy who was constantly bullied. The other children would steal his belongings and throw his clothes into the water. I couldn't stand watching him suffer, so I always stepped in, chasing away the bullies. I even told him to call me Big Sis, and promised to protect him. I still remember the way his eyes sparkled back then. But after a few years he was adopted, and a few months later so was I. Looking at Reynold now, something clicked. His features overlapped with the image of that chubby little boy from my past. No wonder he had always felt so familiar. If I hadn't realized it, I would never have linked the adorable child to the man standing in front of me now. Reynold led me to a worn-out wall, its yellowed surface covered with carvings. One inscription stood out immediately, bringing a wave of nostalgia. It read, "I will take my little brother to conquer the world someday." That was my handwriting. Below it, in smaller letters, was another line. "I will go with Big Sis to conquer the world." Smiled. This must have been Reynolds' writing. Suddenly, Reynold hugged me from behind, burying his face in the crook of my neck. His voice was quiet yet firm. "It's not that I suddenly like you. I've always liked you." He was answering the question I had asked earlier. After that, Reynold and I officially became a couple. When we returned to campus, he publicly confessed to me, and I accepted. Someone recorded the moment, and since Reynold was already a well-known figure on campus, the video quickly spread. Most of the comments were overwhelmingly positive, congratulating us and saying we were a perfect match. As I scrolled through them, one particular comment caught my eye. It was ridiculous, and the profile picture was of an Alaskan Malamute. Without hesitation, I blocked the user. Just then my phone rang. It was one of Reynolds' friends, informing me that Reynold had been injured during a basketball game and had lost a lot of blood. Without wasting another second, I rushed out of my dorm. As I stepped outside, I was met with an unexpected sight. Orville. He grabbed my wrist tightly. Are you and Reynold together? I yanked my arm away, already feeling the sting from his grip. So what if we are? What's it to you? I asked coldly. His expression darkened. Are you really doing this just to spite me? I raised an eyebrow. He still thought this was about him. Are you still mad about me peeling shrimp for Charlotte that day? Fine, I won't help her anymore, but don't. I cut him off sharply. Enough. I don't care what you're about to say. I'm busy. Don't ever come looking for me again. Without sparing him another glance, I turned and headed straight to the basketball court. When I arrived, I saw Reynold surrounded by a group of people. His face was pale, his expression blank, as if he wasn't the one sitting there, bleeding. But the moment his eyes met mine, his demeanor changed. He immediately reached for me, hugging me tightly, his eyes watering. It hurts so much, he murmured, his voice filled with frustration. I gently stroked his head and looked down at his injury. His calf had a deep gash, blood flowing uncontrollably. Seeing the wound made my heart ache. We need to go to the hospital, I said, helping him up. As I turned, I noticed Orville standing a short distance away. His face twisted with anger and disbelief. I ignored him and focused on getting Reynold the medical attention he needed. While the doctor bandaged Reynold's wound, I received a text message. So this is what you were so busy with, running to Reynold's side. It was from Orville. I rolled my eyes and replied, none of your business, before blocking him. Once Reynold was bandaged, he kept staring at me, smiling like an idiot. I sighed, patting his head. How did you end up like this? Later that night, Charlotte sent me a message, asking to meet at a cafe. I already knew what she wanted. When I arrived, she had an arrogant, smug expression, a stark contrast to the weak demeanor she put on in front of Orville. She placed a bracelet on the table, making sure I saw it. You recognize this, don't you? She sneered. I only mentioned it to Orville, and the next day he gave it to me. You really love picking up other people's leftovers, don't you? I leaned back and smiled. In that case, you should know you're one of them. Her face twisted with rage. Trembling, she grabbed her coffee and threw it at me. Dorothy, why don't you just die? You broke up with Orville, yet you still seduce him every day. I'm telling you, he only loves me. Wiping the coffee from my face, I calmly stood up, grabbed her by the hair, and slammed her head against the table. Then, I delivered a loud slap across her face. She shrieked, struggling, but I gave her another slap, making sure both sides of her face were equally red. Her screams attracted attention, so I poured the other cup of coffee onto her face before letting go and quickly leaving. Back in my dorm, Charlotte bombarded me with insults and threats. Her texts were a far cry from the delicate, kind act she put on for Orville. I wondered how he'd react if he saw her true colors. Not that I cared. Orville continued harassing me, standing outside my dorm, sending messages from different numbers. Tired of their constant interference, I gathered the surveillance footage from the cafe, along with Charlotte's hateful texts, and sent them to Orville. I also sent screenshots of Orville's daily harassment to Charlotte, with a simple caption, "Control your ugly man. I'm not interested." After that, both of them left me alone. Their relationship started falling apart, and soon, they had no energy left to bother me anymore. Time passed. The last I heard of them was at a reunion years later. Charlotte had latched onto a wealthy man, but he was already married. His wife eventually found out and humiliated her publicly. Though he did divorce and marry Charlotte, he soon started cheating on her, leaving her in misery. As for Orville, his family went bankrupt. He dropped out of school, turned to alcohol, and struggled to even afford a meal. I barely reacted to the news. It was their own doing. Suddenly, my friend Holla nudged me. "Your husband's here to pick you up. Leaving early again, huh?" I laughed. What can I say? I'm under strict management. Stepping outside, I saw Reynold waiting in the snow. He walked up to me, draped another coat over my shoulders, and smiled warmly as he rubbed my cold nose. "Let's go home," he said, taking my hand. And I went without looking back. If you like this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories like these only at StoryTimes.